In a land of silken sleeves and scandalous scrolls, where cherry blossoms fell slower than the courtship and fans were used more for flirting than cooling, the empresses of Japan had secrets tucked behind every paper screen. Their lovers, not warriors, not rebels, but poets who rhymed accidentally, monks who blinked too often, and cats who may or may not have been reincarnated samurai. This is not a tale of passion. It's a tale of protocol, prolonged eye contact, and love letters written in invisible ink. So fluff your pillow, sip your sleepy tea, and prepare for a romance so slow it makes snails look impulsive. By the time the last kiss almost happens, you'll be snoring. And hey, before you drift off into a dream about imperial fan folding techniques, don't forget to like and subscribe to this bedtime nonsense. Drop a comment from your futon, hammock, or suspiciously squeaky bunk bed, and let us know, where are you watching from, and how many glances does it take to fall in love? Spoiler, it's more than 3. In the year 593, Empress Suiko ascended the chrysanthemum throne with the serenity of a cloud and the posture of someone who had never slouched in her life. Her court was a quiet place, so quiet, in fact, that the loudest sound was the occasional sigh of a court lady realizing she had embroidered the wrong crane. Among the many monks who wandered the palace halls in search of enlightenment and miso soup, one stood out, Horan the Blinkful. He was known for his spiritual wisdom, his gentle chanting, and his inability to maintain eye contact for more than 3 seconds. Some said he blinked in Morse code. Others said he was just shy. Empress Suiko said nothing, but she noticed. Their first encounter was legendary in its lack of excitement. Horan dropped a scroll near her feet. She picked it up. He bowed. She nodded. A court poet fainted from the sheer tension. From that day on, their romance unfolded like a very slow origami crane. They exchanged glances across incense-filled corridors. He blinked. She blinked back. He blinked twice. She blinked once. It was a conversation of sorts. One day, Horan left a poem on her writing desk. It read, "The moon is full. My heart is half. I blink, and you appear." Suiko read it. She smiled. She sent him a fan. He sent her a sandal. She sent it back. He understood. Their love was never spoken aloud. It was folded into fans, hidden in scrolls, and whispered between blinks. No one ever saw them touch. No one ever heard them speak. But everyone agreed. Something was definitely almost happening. And so, dear dreamer, as you drift into sleep, remember the tale of Empress Suiko and the monk who blinked. Love doesn't always need fireworks. Sometimes it just needs a scroll, a sandal, and a very well-timed blink. In the year 642, Empress Kogyoku ruled with the elegance of a crane and the emotional range of a well-folded fan. Her palace was a place of quiet contemplation, where courtiers debated the philosophical meaning of plum blossoms and tried not to trip over their own metaphors. Among them was a poet named Fujiwara no Yanosuke, whose verses were so soporific they were prescribed as natural sleep aids. His poems rarely made sense, but they always rhymed, an unforgivable offense in the world of classical Japanese poetry, where rhyme was considered as vulgar as chewing loudly. One day, Yonosuke stood before the empress and recited, "The moon is bright, the koi are tight, I dream of fans in pale moonlight." The court gasped. A lady-in-waiting fainted. A monk coughed politely. Kogyoku blinked twice, which in imperial body language meant, I am intrigued, but also mildly offended. She summoned him to her chamber, not for punishment, but for clarification. Why do your poems rhyme? She asked, sipping tea with the precision of someone who had practiced for decades. Yonosuke bowed, so deeply he nearly kissed the tatami mat. Because, Your Majesty, I believe love should be lyrical, even if it's illegal. She didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She simply handed him a rice cracker and said, "Write me a poem about silence." He did. It rhymed. She sighed. Their romance was built on forbidden rhymes and shared snacks. He wrote verses like, "Your gaze is soft, your fan aloft, my heart is lost, my soul is tossed." She responded with haikus that didn't rhyme, but smelled faintly of affection. Rice cracker broken. Crumbs fall like cherry blossoms. You blink too often. They never touched. They never kissed. But once, during a poetry contest, she awarded him second place. He cried. She blinked. The court erupted in scandalous silence. And so, dear sleeper, as your eyelids grow heavy and your thoughts begin to rhyme against your will, remember the tale of Empress Kogyoku and the poet who rhymed too well. Love, like poetry, doesn't always follow the rules. Sometimes it just needs a rice cracker and a really awkward stanza. Empress Jito ruled with the grace of a falling leaf and the emotional restraint of a well-polished bonsai pot. Her palace gardens were legendary, so meticulously arranged that even the butterflies flew in formation. Every pebble had a purpose, every pond had a poem, and every bush was trimmed by Tanaka the Silent, a gardener whose shears were sharper than his social skills. Tanaka never spoke. He communicated through topiary. One day, he trimmed a bush into the shape of a chrysanthemum. The empress nodded. The next day, he shaped a pine into a crane. She blinked twice. Then, on a particularly windy afternoon, he trimmed a camellia into the unmistakable shape of a heart. The court gasped. A lady-in-waiting dropped her fan. A poet began composing a scandalous haiku. Jito stared at the heart-shaped bush for a full minute, then turned and walked away. Her version of a love letter. The next morning, Tanaka found a rake on his workbench. It was imperial, gold-tipped, engraved with the words, "Trim with caution." He bowed to it. He trimmed a new bush into the shape of a question mark. Their romance was a horticultural whisper. No words, no letters, just leaves, shapes, and the occasional symbolic pebble. Once, Tanaka arranged stones in a spiral. Jito walked the spiral in silence. That was their date. Years passed, seasons changed. The garden bloomed and faded. Tanaka aged like moss, quietly, gracefully, and slightly damp. When he retired, he left behind one final creation, a cherry tree pruned into the shape of a sleeping fox. Jito visited it every spring. She never spoke of him, but every time she passed the tree, she sighed, softly, like wind through bamboo. And so, dear dreamer, remember the tale of Empress Jito and the gardener who trimmed too close. Love doesn't always need words. Sometimes it just needs a rake, a bush, and a heart-shaped hedge that says everything without saying anything. In the year 707, Empress Genmei ruled with the poise of a perfectly balanced ink brush and the emotional subtlety of a well-folded letter. Her court was a place of quiet elegance, where every syllable was measured, every robe was steamed, and every scroll was written with the kind of flourish that made butterflies blush. Enter Saito, the ink-stained, a calligrapher whose brushwork was so graceful it was rumored to cure hiccups. He didn't speak much. His words were reserved for paper. His sleeves were always smudged with ink, his fingers perpetually stained with poetic regret. One morning, Genmei received a scroll from Saito. It was supposed to say, "Morning greetings, Your Majesty." Instead, it read, "The sun rises, but not as gently as your sigh." She blinked. Her tea cooled. A court lady gasped so softly, it registered as a breeze. Intrigued, Genmei summoned Saito, not for reprimand, but for clarification. "Why do you write like a man in love?" she asked, her voice as smooth as rice paper. Saito bowed so deeply, his ink pot tipped over. "Because, Your Majesty, I am in love with the shape of your name." She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply handed him a blank scroll and said, "Write me something I've never seen." He did. It was a single character, invented, mysterious. It looked like a crane doing yoga. She stared at it for 3 hours. Their romance was written in brush strokes and sealed with wax. No words were exchanged, only scrolls. One read, "The wind carries your name." Another, "I spilled ink thinking of you." Her reply was a fan with his initials embroidered in thread, so fine it could only be seen at sunset. Once, during a festival, Saito wrote her name on a lantern. It floated into the sky. She watched it until it disappeared. That was their date. Years later, when Saito retired to a quiet mountain temple, Genmei sent him one final scroll. It read, "The ink has dried, but the brush remembers, and so, dear dreamer, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift like lanterns on a lake, remember the tale of Empress Genmei and the calligrapher who wrote too beautifully. Love doesn't always speak. It writes, it stains, it folds itself into paper and waits to be read." In the year 749, Empress Koken ruled with the composure of a perfectly balanced rice bowl and the emotional subtlety of a cloud drifting over a mountain. Her palace was a place of quiet rituals, whispered prayers, and incense so thick it occasionally caused minor philosophical hallucinations. Enter Dokyo, a Buddhist priest whose chants could be heard from 3 provinces away. He didn't just chant, he performed. His voice boomed like thunder wrapped in silk. Birds paused mid-flight. Monks wept. Tea cooled prematurely. Koken was intrigued, not by the theology, not by the politics, but by the sheer volume. "Why do you chant like you're trying to wake the ancestors?" she asked one morning, sipping her tea with the grace of someone who had never spilled anything in her life. Dokyo bowed so deeply, his prayer beads clattered like scandal. "Because, Your Majesty, love should be loud." She blinked. He chanted louder. A court lady fainted. A scroll caught fire. The palace squirrel moved out. Their romance was a slow crescendo. He chanted. She listened. He chanted softer. She leaned in. He chanted in metaphor. She sent him a fan. He chanted in haiku. She sent him a sandal. He chanted in silence. She sent him a scroll that read, "Finally." Rumors spread like spilled ink. Was he her spiritual advisor? Her secret consort? Her personal sound system? Historians still debate. What's certain is that Dokyo's influence grew louder than his chants. He wanted to be emperor. She considered it. The court panicked. A poet wrote a haiku that simply read, "Too loud, too close." The priest chants, and the throne trembles. Eventually, Dokyo was exiled, not for love, not for ambition, but for excessive chanting. Koken sighed. The palace returned to silence. The squirrel moved back in, and so, as your dreams begin to chant softly in your ears, remember the tale of Empress Koken and the priest who chanted too loud. Love doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it echoes through the halls, shakes the scrolls, and leaves behind a sandal and a scandal. In the year 715, Empress Gensho ruled with the precision of a perfectly folded kimono and the emotional restraint of a well-behaved rice grain. Her court was orderly, her scrolls were flawless, and her title, Empress of the Realm of the Rising Sun, was considered sacred, poetic, and absolutely not to be misspelled. Enter Nakamura the Nervous, a scribe whose hands trembled like bamboo in a breeze, and whose ink blotches were considered modern art by accident. He was diligent, loyal, and tragically prone to typos. One morning, tasked with transcribing a ceremonial decree, Nakamura wrote, "By the grace of the heavens, we honor Her Majesty, Empress of Naps." The court froze. A lady-in-waiting dropped her fan. A monk whispered, "Finally, some honesty." Gensho stared at the scroll. Then she laughed, a soft, dignified laugh that sounded like a silk sleeve brushing against a plum blossom. She summoned Nakamura. He arrived with 3 apology scrolls, 2 backup ink pots, and a faint hope of survival. "Empress of Naps?" she asked, sipping tea with the calm of someone who had once napped through a thunderstorm. Nakamura bowed so deeply he nearly vanished. "It was a slip of the brush, Your Majesty. I meant sun. But perhaps it was the truth." She blinked. He blinked. A poet began composing a haiku titled Nap Queen. Their romance began not with a love letter, but with a typo. She sent him a pillow embroidered with the imperial crest. He sent her a scroll that read, "Your reign is restful, your gaze a lullaby. I dream in your shadow." They never kissed. They never held hands. But once, during a particularly long council meeting, she looked at him and yawned. He yawned back. That was their date. Years later, when Nakamura retired to a quiet village known for its napping festivals, Gensho sent him one final scroll. It read, "Even the sun rests. Thank you for the title I never knew I needed." And so, dear, as your eyelids droop and your thoughts begin to typo themselves into dreams, remember the tale of Empress Gensho and the scribe who misspelled her title. Love doesn't always arrive perfectly penned. Sometimes it slips, spills, and naps its way into history. In the year 1629, Empress Meisho ruled with the elegance of a silk ribbon and the emotional mystery of a closed lacquer box. Her palace was quiet, her court was composed, and her favorite companion was not a poet, not a monk, not a gardener, but a cat. His name was Tora, and he was no ordinary feline. He sat like a samurai, stared like a philosopher, and once knocked over a priceless vase with such deliberate grace that the court debated whether it was performance art. Tora had stripes like brush strokes and a tail that curled with imperial confidence. He never meowed. He simply appeared on cushions, scrolls, and occasionally atop the Empress's writing desk, where he would stare at her as if judging her haiku. Rumors spread. Was Tora the reincarnation of a fallen warrior? A cursed nobleman? A very judgmental monk? One court lady swore he bowed once. Another claimed he meditated. A poet wrote, "The cat watches. I feel unworthy. He blinks. I apologize." Meisho adored him. She fed him sashimi from golden dishes. She embroidered his name into her sleeves. Once, she wrote a poem that read, "Tora walks softly, yet my heart thunders like distant drums." Their love was silent, furry, and slightly mystical. No one dared question it. Once, a visiting noble sneezed near Tora. The Empress exiled him for disharmony. The sneeze was never mentioned again. Tora's favorite pastime was sitting beside Meisho during council meetings, blinking slowly at ministers who dared speak too loudly. His presence was calming, his judgment eternal. When Tora passed away, peacefully on a silk pillow embroidered with cranes, the Empress declared a day of mourning. She wore black. She wrote no poetry. She stared at his favorite cushion for 3 days. And then she wrote, "The warrior sleeps. His tail no longer curls, but I still bow. And so, as you curl up like a cat in moonlight, remember the tale of Empress Meisho and the feline who may have been a samurai. Love doesn't always purr. Sometimes it watches, judges, and knocks over a vase with perfect timing." In the year 1762, Empress Go Sakuramachi ruled with the serenity of a moonlit pond and the emotional depth of a well-polished mirror. Her palace was a place of reflection. Literally, every chamber held a mirror. Every mirror held a secret, and every secret was slightly more dramatic than the last. Among her many possessions was one particular mirror, gifted by a traveling monk, who claimed it could reveal not just one's face, but one's fate. Naturally, the court dismissed him as a poetic lunatic. The Empress, however, was intrigued. She placed the mirror in her private chamber beside a vase of plum blossoms and a scroll that read, "Truth is a reflection, not a declaration." Each night, she gazed into it, and one night, she saw him, not a courtier, not a monk, not a gardener, but a man with eyes like storm clouds and a smile that made her tea go cold. He was handsome. He was fictional. He was in the mirror. She blinked. He blinked back. She leaned in. He leaned closer. A court lady screamed, quietly. A poet wrote, "She loves a shadow." A man made of moonlight. The mirror sighs. Their romance was reflective. She spoke to him in whispers. He answered in silence. She wrote him letters and pressed them against the glass. He responded with foggy shapes and eyebrow raises. Once, she tried to touch him. Her hand met glass. He vanished. She wept. The mirror cracked. The court declared it a tragic accident. The Empress declared it heartbreak. She ordered the mirror to be buried in the royal garden beneath a cherry tree that never bloomed again. Years later, she wrote, "I saw him once, in silver silence. He was everything I imagined, and nothing I could hold. And so, as your thoughts begin to shimmer, and your dreams reflect back at you, remember the tale of Empress Go Sakura Machi and the mirror that reflected too much. Love doesn't always live in reality. Sometimes it lives in glass, in glances, and in the quiet space between imagination and sleep." In the late 19th century, Empress Shokin ruled with the elegance of a falling cherry blossom and the emotional restraint of a well-folded fan. Her court was modernizing. Telegraphs buzzed, trains puffed, and yet her heart remained firmly planted in the era of handwritten poetry and dramatic glances. Enter Hiroshi, the bold folder, a fan maker whose creations were so exquisite they were rumored to cause spontaneous sighs. His fans didn't just cool, they spoke. One fluttered meant, "Hello." 2 flutters meant, "I'm intrigued." 3 flutters meant, "I might faint." One day, Hiroshi presented the Empress with a fan unlike any other. It was lacquered in midnight blue, edged in gold, and, scandalously, folded into the shape of a heart. The court gasped. A lady-in-waiting dropped her tea. A poet began composing a haiku titled Fan of Forbidden Feelings. Shokin stared at the fan, then at Hiroshi, then back at the fan. She blinked once. He bowed. She blinked twice. He folded another fan, this time shaped like a question mark. Their romance unfolded like origami in slow motion. She sent him a silk ribbon. He tied it to a fan and sent it back. She sent him a poem. Your folds speak louder than ministers' speeches. I flutter back. He replied with a fan that opened to reveal a single word. Always. They never touched. They never kissed. But once, during a diplomatic banquet, she used his fan to hide a smile. He saw it. That was their date. Years later, when Hiroshi retired to a quiet village known for its wind, Shokin sent him one final fan. It was plain, unfolded, silent, but inside, stitched in silver thread, were the words, You folded my heart. I never unfolded it. And so, as your breath slows and your thoughts flutter like fans in moonlight, remember the tale of Empress Shokin and the fan maker who folded too boldly. Love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it folds, flutters, and hides behind silk until the moment is just right. In the early 20th century, Empress Teimei ruled with the grace of a crane in a snowstorm and the emotional subtlety of a teacup that asked just slightly too warm. Her palace was a blend of tradition and modernity. Electric lights flickered beside ancient scrolls, and typewriters clacked in rhythm with the rustle of silk robes. Among the many artists who passed through her court was Kenshiro the Crimson, a painter known for his dramatic brushwork, his obsession with dragons, and his unapologetic overuse of the color red. His dragons weren't just fierce, they were flaming. His koi fish looked mildly furious. Even his cherry blossoms seemed to be shouting. One day, Kenshiro unveiled a mural in the Empress's private garden. It depicted a dragon soaring over Mount Fuji, breathing fire shaped like plum blossoms. The entire piece was red. Red dragon, red sky, red mountain, red plum blossoms. The court gasped. A lady-in-waiting dropped her parasol. A diplomat fainted from chromatic overload. Teimei stared at the mural, then at Kenshiro, then back at the mural. Why so much red? She asked, sipping her tea with the calm of someone who had just witnessed a visual riot. Kenshiro bowed. Because, Your Majesty, red is the color of courage, and also of longing. She blinked. He blinked. A poet began composing a haiku titled Red Regret. Their romance was painted in layers. He sent her a scroll with a dragon curled into the shape of a heart. She sent him a fan with a single red stroke across it. He painted her silhouette into a storm cloud. She sent him a sandal. He painted it red. They never kissed. They never held hands. But once, during a spring festival, she wore a crimson sash. He saw it. That was their date. Years later, when Kenshiro retired to a quiet coastal village known for its fog and lack of red things, Teimei sent him one final painting. It was of a dragon sleeping beneath a cherry tree. The dragon was gray. The blossoms were white. But in the corner, barely visible, was a single red dot. It was shaped like a heart. And so, as your thoughts swirl like dragons in moonlight, remember the tale of Empress Teimei and the painter who used too much red. Love doesn't always blend. Sometimes it clashes, splashes, and leaves behind a mural that makes everyone squint, but makes one person sigh. In the early 20th century, Empress Kojun ruled with the quiet dignity of a paper lantern floating down a river and the emotional subtlety of a sigh muffled by silk. Her palace was a place of soft light, long shadows, and corridors that squeaked just enough to make gossip feel suspenseful. Among the many attendants who kept the palace aglow was Takeshi the Illuminator, a lantern keeper whose job was simple: light the lanterns, trim the wicks, and never, under any circumstances, make eye contact with the Empress. Naturally, he failed at the last part. Takeshi had a habit of lighting lanterns too brightly. His flames flickered with flair. His wicks burned with ambition. One evening, he lit the lantern outside the Empress's chamber so brilliantly that a passing poet mistook it for the moon and wrote a haiku about lunar jealousy. Kojun noticed. She stepped outside, blinked at the lantern, and said, "It's very awake." Takeshi bowed. "Forgive me, Your Majesty. I may have used too much oil, and possibly emotion." She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply handed him a fan and said, "Try again." Dimly, their romance flickered like a flame in a drafty hallway. He lit lanterns in patterns. One bright, one soft, one shaped like a question. She responded with shadows. Her silhouette framed just so. Her footsteps timed to match the rhythm of his glow. Once, he left a lantern outside her chamber with a message carved into the wood. "Even in darkness, your light finds me." She replied by placing a sandal beside it. He understood. They never touched. They never kissed. But once, during a winter solstice ceremony, she paused beside his lantern and whispered, "This one is perfect." He fainted. That was their date. Years later, when Takeshi retired to a quiet village, known for its fog and extremely dim lanterns, Kojun sent him one final gift: a lantern made of silver paper, folded into the shape of a heart. Inside was a wick, unlit. And so, as your thoughts begin to glow softly, and your breath flickers like candlelight, remember the tale of Empress Kojun and the lantern keeper who lit too brightly. Love doesn't always blaze. Sometimes it glows, dims, and waits patiently in the hallway, just bright enough to be noticed. In the late 20th century, Empress Michiko ruled with the grace of a falling petal and the emotional precision of a needle threading silk. Her palace was a quiet hum of tradition and modernity, fax machines beside folding screens, and whispers of love sewn into seams no one dared inspect. Among her attendants was Aiko the Threaded, a seamstress whose stitches were so fine they were rumored to hold secrets. She didn't speak much. She let her embroidery do the talking, and what it said was suspiciously romantic. One day, Michiko received a new kimono. It shimmered like moonlight and smelled faintly of plum blossoms. But what caught her eye was the lining. Embroidered in silver thread, hidden beneath folds, was a tiny crane holding a scroll. On the scroll, a single word, "Dream." She summoned Aiko. "Why is there a crane in my lining?" she asked, sipping tea with the poise of someone who had never spilled a drop in her life. Aiko bowed. "Because, Your Majesty, dreams should be worn close to the heart." The Empress blinked. A court lady gasped. A poet began composing a haiku titled "Thread of Longing." Their romance was sewn in silence. Aiko stitched messages into hems, cuffs, and collars. Michiko wore them. Once, she found a tiny embroidered fan tucked into the sleeve of her ceremonial robe. She sent Aiko a sandal. Aiko stitched a reply into the sole. "I walk with you." They never kissed. They never touched. But once, during a state banquet, Michiko wore a robe with a hidden message stitched into the back. "You are the thread in my silence." Aiko saw it. That was their date. Years later, when Aiko retired to a quiet village known for its looms and unusually poetic laundry, Michiko sent her one final gift, a bolt of silk, untouched, with a single silver thread running through it in the shape of a heart. And so, as your thoughts begin to unravel into dreams, and your breath slows like a needle through cloth, remember the tale of Empress Michiko and the seamstress who sewed her dreams. Love doesn't always speak. Sometimes it stitches, folds, and hides itself in the lining, waiting to be worn. In the early 21st century, Empress Masako reigned with the quiet strength of a well-preserved scroll and the emotional complexity of a footnote that requires a second footnote. Her palace was a blend of tradition and scholarship, where every conversation risked becoming a citation and every eyebrow raise could be historically significant. Enter Professor Kenji, the over-referencer, a court historian whose love for marginalia rivaled his love for breathing. He annotated everything: tea ceremonies, fan gestures, even the Empress's pauses. His most controversial paper was titled The Semiotics of Imperial Eyebrow Movement, a case study in silent diplomacy. Masako read it. She blinked. A court lady gasped. A poet began composing a haiku titled Footnote of Desire. She summoned Kenji. "Why annotate my eyebrows?" she asked, sipping tea with the precision of someone who had once footnoted her own sigh. Kenji bowed. "Because, Your Majesty, they speak volumes, and I am but a humble translator." Their romance was academic. He sent her scrolls filled with citations. She replied with fans embroidered with ellipses. Once, he footnoted a sandal she left in the hallway. His annotation read, possibly symbolic, possibly romantic, possibly accidental. See Appendix D. She responded with a scroll that read, "Your margins are where I hide my thoughts." They never kissed. They never touched. But once, during a symposium on imperial silence, she raised her eyebrow at him. He fainted. That was their date. Years later, when Kenji retired to a quiet library known for its dust and emotionally charged indexes, Masako sent him one final gift, a scroll with no text, no title, no footnotes, just a single inked eyebrow, arched in mystery. And so, as your thoughts begin to footnote themselves, and your breath slows like a well-paced lecture, remember the tale of Empress Masako and the historian who annotated her eyebrows. Love doesn't always declare itself. Sometimes it hides in margins, whispers through citations, and raises an eyebrow that rewrites history. In the year 1000, Empress Shoshi ruled with the elegance of a silk purse and the emotional precision of a well-balanced ledger. Her court was a place of poetry, politics, and perfectly counted coins, each one polished, catalogued, and occasionally used to settle disputes about who blinked first during tea ceremonies. Enter Kentaro the Clink, a coin collector whose obsession with currency bordered on romantic. He didn't just count coins. He communed with them. He whispered to them. He arranged them in patterns that resembled constellations, and once claimed to have found a coin that blushed when touched. One spring morning, Kentaro was tasked with verifying the Empress's ceremonial dowry chest. It contained 10,000 imperial coins, each stamped with a chrysanthemum and a whisper of scandal. He counted. He recounted. He triple counted. And then he declared, with trembling voice, "Your Majesty, there are 9,999 coins." The court gasped. A lady in waiting fainted onto a pile of cushions. A poet began composing a haiku titled Missing Coin, Found Heart. Shoshi raised an eyebrow. Are you certain? Kentaro bowed. I am certain, Your Majesty, but I believe the missing coin is mine. She blinked. He blinked. A monk coughed in romantic suspense. Their romance began with a miscount. He sent her a coin engraved with a tiny heart. She sent him a sandal. He returned it with a note. I'll count this as one. They never kissed. They never touched. But once, during a treasury audit, she paused beside him and whispered, I trust your math. He dropped his abacus. That was their date. Years later, when Kentaro retired to a quiet village, known for its suspiciously shiny coins and emotionally charged accounting practices, Shoshi sent him one final gift, a pouch containing a single imperial coin. On one side, the chrysanthemum. On the other, a sandal. And so, dear dreamer, as your thoughts begin to clink and your breath slows like a coin rolling across tatami, remember the tale of Empress Shoshi and the coin collector who miscounted her dowry. Love doesn't always add up. Sometimes it subtracts, divides, and leaves behind one coin that means more than all the rest. In the year 1037, Empress Kenshi ruled with the serenity of a tide at dusk and the emotional depth of a poem written on sea foam. Her palace was quiet, her court composed, and her favorite pastime was collecting seashells, each one chosen not for its shape, but for the secrets it might hold. Enter Haruto the listener, a shell whisperer whose talent was as mysterious as it was mildly concerning. He claimed he could hear voices in shells, not just echoes, but memories, regrets, and occasionally unsolicited advice from ancient crabs. One day, Kenshi handed him a spiral shell from the shores of Ise. What does it say? She asked, sipping tea with the calm of someone who had once negotiated a treaty using only eyebrow movements. Haruto pressed the shell to his ear. He blinked. It says, You are lonely. The court gasped. A lady in waiting dropped her fan. A poet began composing a haiku titled Lonely Spiral. Kenshi stared at him. And what do you say? Haruto bowed. I say, I'm listening. Their romance unfolded in whispers. She gave him shells. He gave her scrolls filled with what they said. One shell said, she dreams of plum blossoms. Another said, he fears being too loud. One said nothing. That one made her cry. Once, she sent him a sandal. He placed it inside a conch and returned it. She found a message etched into the soul. Even the ocean walks toward you. They never kissed. They never touched. But once, during a moonlit walk by the koi pond, she handed him a shell and said, This one is quiet. He smiled. That was their date. Years later, when Haruto retired to a quiet coastal village, known for its whispering waves and emotionally unstable oysters, Kenshi sent him one final gift, a shell carved from jade, sealed with wax. Inside was a note. You listened too well. Now I hear you even in silence. And so, as your breath slows and your thoughts begin to echo softly through the chambers of sleep, remember the tale of Empress Kenshi and the shell whisperer who listened too well. Love doesn't always speak. Sometimes it listens, echoes, and curls itself into a spiral, waiting to be heard. In the year 1110, Empress Reiko ruled with the grace of a ladle, dipped in moonlight, and the emotional restraint of a perfectly balanced broth. Her palace was a place of quiet refinement, where every dish was a poem, every spoonful a diplomatic gesture, and every misplaced sesame seed a potential scandal. Enter Chef Noboru the Stirred, a culinary artist whose soups were so emotionally complex they were once described as a warm hug followed by a gentle existential crisis. Noboru didn't just cook, he felt. His miso had melancholy, his ramen had regret, his dumplings whispered secrets. One winter evening, Reiko tasted his seasonal soup. It was rich, fragrant, and, according to her palate, suspiciously heartfelt. She summoned him. "Why does my soup taste like longing?" she asked, sipping with the poise of someone who had once negotiated a treaty over tempura. Noboru bowed. "Because, Your Majesty, I stirred it while thinking of you." The court gasped. A lady-in-waiting dropped her chopsticks. A poet began composing a haiku titled Salted with Sighs. Their romance simmered slowly. She sent him a sandal. He returned it inside a bowl of rice. She sent him a fan. He folded it into a dumpling. She wrote, "Your broth warms me, even when served cold." He replied with a menu titled Courses of the Heart. It featured appetizer, glance soup, main course, unspoken feelings, stew, dessert, blush mochi. They never kissed. They never touched. But once, during a moon viewing banquet, she tasted his soup and smiled. He fainted. That was their date. Years later, when Noboru retired to a quiet village known for its emotionally unstable tofu and romantically seasoned rice, Reiko sent him one final gift, a lacquered bowl, empty, with a note inside. "You filled me, even when I didn't ask." And so, as your breath slows and your thoughts begin to simmer gently in the pot of sleep, remember the tale of Empress Reiko and the chef who salted her soup with emotion. Love doesn't always boil. Sometimes it simmers, seasons, and serves itself quietly, one spoonful at a time. In the year 1185, Empress Toko ruled with the stillness of a temple bell at midnight and the emotional weight of a cedar beam, holding up centuries of silence. Her palace was a place of polished wood, whispered apologies, and furniture that knew more secrets than the ministers who sat on it. Enter Daiichi, the grain reader, a carpenter whose hands were calloused with sorrow and whose joints creaked with stories. He didn't just build, he remembered. Every plank he touched seemed to sigh. Every chair he carved leaned slightly toward melancholy. One spring, Toko commissioned a new throne. "Make it strong," she said. "Make it quiet." Daiichi bowed. "I will make it honest." He chose aged cypress. He carved without sketches. He sanded with tears. When he presented the throne, it was beautiful, simple, solemn, and unmistakably sad. The backrest curved like a sigh. The armrests trembled slightly. The seat held the weight of something unspoken. The court stared. A lady-in-waiting dropped her scroll. A poet began composing a haiku titled Throne of Almost. Toko sat. She blinked. "Why does it feel like regret?" Daiichi bowed. "Because, Your Majesty, I built it while thinking of everything I never said." Their romance was carved in silence. She sent him a sandal. He returned it embedded in a stool. She sent him a fan. He built a cabinet to hold it. She wrote, "You build what I feel. I sit in your sorrow. It fits." He replied by carving a bench shaped like a question mark. She placed it in her garden. That was their date. They never kissed. They never touched. But once, during a storm, she sat on his throne and whispered, "It creaks like you." He heard it. That was their echo. Years later, when Daiichi retired to a quiet forest, known for its emotionally unstable trees and romantically warped lumber, Toko sent him one final gift, a chisel wrapped in silk. engraved with the words, "You built me, even when I didn't ask." And so, as your thoughts begin to settle like sawdust, and your breath slows like a sanding rhythm, remember the tale of Empress Toko and the carpenter who built her a throne of regret. Love doesn't always stand tall. Sometimes it leans, creaks, and holds the weight of everything unsaid. In the year 1253, Empress Ayako ruled with the grace of a crane mid-flight and the emotional delicacy of a feather caught in a breeze. Her palace was a sanctuary of silence, where even the wind tiptoed and the curtains swayed with purpose. She was known for her composure, her wisdom, and her peculiar fondness for feathers. Enter Riku, the Drifted, a feather collector whose obsession with plumage bordered on poetic madness. He didn't hunt birds. He waited for feathers to fall. He claimed each feather carried a memory, a whisper, a choice not yet made. His collection was vast: swan, heron, sparrow, phoenix, allegedly. One morning, Ayako found a feather on her pillow. It was soft, white, and tied with a thread of gold. She summoned Riku. "Why is there a feather in my bed?" she asked, sipping tea with the serenity of someone who had once calmed a thunderstorm with a lullaby. Riku bowed. "Because, Your Majesty, fate has landed." The court gasped. A lady-in-waiting dropped her fan. A poet began composing a haiku titled "Tickled by Destiny." Their romance floated gently. She sent him a sandal. He returned it wrapped in dove feathers. She sent him a fan. He replied with a scroll that read, "You stir the wind. I follow the drift." Once, during a spring festival, he released a handful of feathers into the air. One landed on her shoulder. She didn't brush it away. That was their date. They never kissed. They never touched. But once, she walked through his aviary and paused beside a heron feather. "This one feels like me," she said. He nodded. That was their echo. Years later, when Riku retired to a quiet hilltop, known for its whispering breezes and emotionally unstable geese, Ayako sent him one final gift, a feather carved from jade, tied with a thread of silver, and a note that read, "You tickled my fate. I never stopped drifting." And so, as your thoughts begin to float and your breath softens like plumage in moonlight, remember the tale of Empress Ayako and the feather collector who tickled her fate. Love doesn't always land loudly. Sometimes it drifts, brushes, and settles quietly, just long enough to be felt. In the year 1324, Empress Noriko ruled with the poise of a perfectly stacked scroll and the emotional subtlety of a footnote written in invisible ink. Her palace was a sanctuary of silence, where knowledge was revered, whispers were cross-referenced, and even gossip was filed under G. Enter Jun the Dewy-Fingered, a librarian whose devotion to order bordered on romantic. He didn't just shelve books. He understood them. He could sense a misplaced volume from across the courtyard. He once alphabetized a collection of love letters by sigh intensity. One morning, Noriko wandered into the Imperial Archive. She found a scroll labeled Unspoken Feelings, Vol Nerai. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a poem, filed under longing, cross-referenced with silence. "Your name appears often," she summoned Jun. "Why is my name in your archive?" she asked, sipping tea with the grace of someone who had once corrected a minister using only punctuation. Jun bowed. "Because, Your Majesty, you are the subject of my favorite chapter." The court gasped. A lady-in-waiting dropped her fan. A poet began composing a haiku titled Index of Affection. Their romance was quiet. and well organized. She sent him a sandal. He cataloged it under S and placed it beside a scroll titled Steps Toward You. She sent him a fan. He filed it under F and added a note. Frequently fluttered when she passes. Once, during a moonlit reading session, she handed him a scroll with no title. He opened it. Inside was a single line. You are overdue. That was their date. They never kissed. They never touched. But once, she rearranged the poetry shelf so his favorite verse sat beside hers. He noticed. That was their echo. Years later, when June retired to a quiet village known for its emotionally charged bookmarks and romantically annotated margins, Noriko sent him one final gift, a scroll labeled Heart Empresses. Inside was a note. You filed me. I remain checked out. And so, as your thoughts begin to shelve themselves and your breath slows like a page turning in moonlight, remember the tale of Empress Noriko and the librarian who alphabetized her heart. Love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through indexes, hides in margins, and waits patiently in the quietest corner of the archive. In the year 990, Empress Teishi ruled with the elegance of a falling petal and the emotional subtlety of a sigh tucked between pages. Her court was a haven of poetry, moonlight, and fleeting glances, where feelings were recorded, not spoken, and where silence was often louder than declarations. Her closest companion was Sei Shonagon, the famed author of the Pillow Book. But this story isn't about Sei. It's about Kaido the Whisperer, a quiet scribe who read pillow books not for their wit, but for their pauses. He claimed the margins held more truth than the text, and that every list Sei wrote was missing one item, longing. Kaido didn't write his own pillow book. He whispered into them. Higaru lean close to the pages and murmur things like, she misses the sound of rain on lacquer, or he regrets not folding the fan before leaving. No one knew who he was talking about, except Teishi. One evening, she found a pillow book on her cushion. It was blank, except for a single line written in the corner. Things that make the heart flutter. A whisper that knows your name. She summoned Kaido. Why do you whisper into books? She asked, sipping tea with the grace of someone who had once edited a poem with a glance. He bowed. Because, Your Majesty, some feelings are too shy to be written. Their romance was quiet and page-bound. She sent him a sandal. He placed it between two pages and returned it. She sent him a fan. He wrote a list titled, Things That Stir the Air When She Enters. Once, during a poetry reading, she opened a pillow book and found a pressed plum blossom. Beneath it, in tiny script, I heard your silence. That was their date. They never kissed. They never touched. But once, she whispered into a book and left it on his desk. He read it. It said, You are the margin I reread. Years later, when Kaito retired to a quiet temple, known for its echoing pages and emotionally unstable ink, Teishi sent him one final gift, a pillow book with no title, no lists, no poems, just a single line on the last page. You whispered me into being, and so, dear dreamer, as your breath slows and your thoughts begin to fold themselves into pages of sleep, remember the tale of Empress Teishi and the Pillow Book Whisperer. Love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it murmurs, pauses, and waits patiently in the margins, ready to be reread when the moon is just right. Good night.